Indeed, for stepping up to the mark here. Let's start straight away, Douglas, with developments within continental Europe, perhaps developments, let's say, Italy and Austria. Crucial votes taking place today.
Yes, one of the most interesting things about the British press at the moment is it's so obsessed with Brexit. But of course the EU is going on, and Europe is going on, the rest of the world is going on, and gosh, how. Today, obviously, the Italians will be going to the polls over the referendum which their Prime Minister has ordered. It's exceptionally difficult to explain what the referendum is actually about. As the Sunday Times shows, they report it as Renzi resists the march of the radical right. What he's proposing is, of course, that the Italian people can limit the Senate and so on. The actual wording is exceptionally long and exceptionally complex, even by Italian referendum standards. But of course it's becoming a referendum on Renzi and a referendum on the EU. And an example of the complexity of it, the Sunday Times quotes two people who are supporting the Prime Minister, and one of them says, "I fear we're not going to make it because too many people have been fooled." And one of the other people who supports the Prime Minister says, "Everyone is throwing themselves into it. I'm confident we will just about win." So
where did we hear that before?
You know, it really is all to play for. But you know, it is fascinating. This is going to be a pattern, I would say. Every single vote that happens in Europe is going to end up being about something else.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe we found that out a little bit with our own Brexit vote as well. There were other things mixed in there. Incredibly complex subject, as we're finding out now. Francis, do you, though, interpret this, and depending which way these votes go, I mean, is it the rise of the far right, or is it something different? I mean, it's anti-politics. Does it necessarily have to be the right?
I think there are differences in different countries. Yeah. I think the Five Star Movement is different to the Freedom Movement, which is certainly a far-right party formed after the war by former Nazis. But I think perhaps the clue is in this article when it talks about 36% unemployment amongst young people. There are real underlying economic causes. Lots of countries have suffered years and years of austerity cuts after the bankers' crash, wages stagnating, people really struggling. And the problem is that too often they turn to easy answers and migrants to blame.
I mean, Chantal, Amy, what's your take on it in the sense that, you know, we're talking about Italy and Austria now, elections coming up in France, big ones, of course, in France and Germany and in Holland and elsewhere. Do you see a trend, some kind of broad trend?
Well, I think one of the challenges is ensuring that the political establishment is able to appeal to the people sufficiently. And I think while each country is slightly different, actually one of the issues that we've seen across, and indeed probably across to the United States, is a lack of connection between the people, or a perceived connection between the people and the establishment politicians, whether from the left or from the right.
And manifesting itself then in specific circumstances in different countries. Francis, well, let's talk about our own country and Brexit. The discussion continue. You're leading with the Observer's lead piece on the front there.
The front page of the Observer, the Tory party could lose the next general election if Theresa May alienates its core of moderate supporters by becoming UKIP light. And that's not the Observer saying that, that's former Conservative ministers and MPs. And I think, I mean, perhaps we're beginning to see the start of a more pragmatic voice in the Conservative Party saying, instead of talking about hard or soft Brexit, maybe we need to get a deal that actually works for the British people.
Well, we're now hearing it's been termed in Downing Street in colours, not black or white, but a grey Brexit.
Yep, which I think from a TUC point of view, we think a good starting place would be, let's put jobs and people's rights at work first. Let's start from that position and build a deal that delivers the best for
But do you believe in the TUC
in
there might be a second referendum?
I can't detect any great public appetite for that currently, but who knows? In the current environment, who knows?
But back to that point the Observer's making, Douglas, I mean, there's this disconnect, and it goes for the Labour Party as well, for many parties, between the constituencies they represent and their views on Brexit.
Yes.
And, you know, some Leavers are in Remain constituencies and Remainers in Leave constituencies.
Absolutely, and I mean, obviously a lot of this is after the defeat of Zach Goldsmith in Richmond by-election. There's obviously a little bit of panicking. I don't think it should be over-egged, this, though. I mean, you know, it's going to be very uncomfortable for some MPs, particularly, of course, Labour MPs who are very, very pro-EU in seats which are, you know, overwhelmingly for leave. But I think sometimes too much can be read into these by-elections, and this is a sort of response to something. It's a very specific set of situations, just as the Italian referendum is specific, just as the Austrian election is specific.
Right.
Richmond by-election was very
But you
specific.
don't see, I mean, there was that polling, wasn't there, that's saying more people define themselves by Remain or Leave than they do by the parties they vote for at general elections.
Well,
fundamental realignment over the years.
There is, some of us think there ought to be a fundamental alignment, but as they say, things that cannot go on usually do. And the political parties have it in their own interests to continue in the way they're currently constructed.
Isn't this also about recognising that in any negotiation there are at least two parties to that negotiation, and it can't just be a case of cake and eat it, as we heard. I was with the Austrian Chancellor on Wednesday in Vienna this week. They have their own set of priorities, their own concerns about what Brexit could or might mean for the political stability and economic security of the EU as a whole. So, I think as a negotiator, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the person on the other side of the table, and maybe people are waking up to that.
And lots of cake there in Vienna as well. That was terrible, wasn't it? Chantal, Amy, global Britain, dimension of this in the Times. And is this about the cultural doors that are opened by Britain's mighty output in music and literature?
Well, that's right. So the article talks about the importance of making a success of Brexit and looking to the global environment, particularly economically. And it's focusing on our soft power. And it talks about Adele and the Bard helping us build a global Britain. I suppose for my members, it's really a focus beyond that. It's looking at making sure that we don't close our doors. And whatever Brexit means at the end of the day, we need to look at the world more broadly. So I've just come back from China, where we were looking to promote UK legal services, which to date are about 25 billion in terms of contribution to the economy. So It's ensuring that we're able to continue to deliver those services.
Well, you have been on your travels. You been anywhere exotic, though?
I travel all the time.
But I want to stay with you, Chantal, because you talked then about legal services, and let's talk about the Supreme Court here. You've got, again in the Observer, a profile of the head of the Supreme Court, David Neuberger.
That's right. So obviously we've got the Article 50 case coming up in the Supreme Court this week, 4 days. This is a very good, comprehensive article really telling us about the case itself, which is about whether or not the government or the executive can trigger Article 50 or whether it needs to go to Parliament first. But it goes deeper, and it also looks at the President of the Supreme Court and indeed at the judiciary. And for me, it's an important story because obviously a few weeks ago we saw some fairly aggressive headlines pitching the judiciary against the people. And it seems to me that the debate has moved on rightly, recognising the
do you
role.
think it will? Depending on which way the Supreme Court rule, and it's already, in other papers, going through all the 11 members of the Supreme Court and giving them star ratings on whether they're pro or anti-EU, looking at their relatives, looking at what they've said in the past about human rights and things like that. Do you not think that is building up again?
Well, I think there's certainly a risk. I think we'll have to wait and see where the press takes it. It seems to me understanding more about our judges, learning more about the justice system can only be a good thing. Quite how far it goes, we'll have to see. The important thing is to remember that whatever the connections of the judiciary, our judges are internationally respected for their ability to be independent.
But would you like to see the politicians, the political class, the senior political class, having stuck up more for the High Court and stick up for the Supreme Court, even if it rules against them?
Yes, it's important to recognise that the press should be entitled to write these stories, but I think it's essential that our senior politicians stand up for what is, in effect, a cornerstone of our democracy.
Quick thought on that, Douglas. Do you think it was mealy-mouthed, the support we heard from Liz Truss, even the Prime Minister for the High Court judges?
They're in a very difficult position. It is interesting, this whole discussion of the individual justices on the Supreme Court is becoming very American. The whole setup of the Supreme Court, some of us felt very American, unnecessary tinkering in some people's views. But, if the judges are going to be involved in politics, then politics is going to take an interest in the judges. And personally, I sort of, regret that it's come to this, but the press is right to take an interest in this. This is about whether or not the Supreme Court stands against the will of the British people. That is no small thing. It's a huge, huge issue.
Just a quick thought on that.
My understanding is that this is a judgment about whether Parliament has powers compared to the government.
And then we'll see whether Parliament stands
against the will of the British people.
It's important for democracy.
But just picking up on that point, it isn't about standing against the will of the people. the Supreme Court are specifically looking at a narrow constitutional point. And indeed, if the judgment is upheld, as Francis said, the decision would then be that it is for Parliament who, at the end of the day, reflects the people.
But and they could go against the people, of course. I mean, that's what this is about.
Well,
This
but then
endless-
Parliament
That's what a
an
parliamentary
endless
judges
system
will.
is about.
But that's the
exactly.
political
The
question.
Parliament may. But this is the huge thing about this is, the British people voted to leave the EU, and a lot of people can't accept that. And there are a lot of ways being invented to stop that.
Well, we're getting back
But
to
that's
then.
a-
I think the MPs get that. But you mentioned America there, Douglas. I want to stay with you. And Republicans backed Trump after this extraordinary call that he received from the president of Taiwan. It goes back to the Carter years, doesn't it? That they don't talk to the Taiwanese.
Yes. This is a really interesting story, I think, because a lot of people who dislike everything about Trump, particularly in the British and European media, will not allow him to put a foot right. And it's very interesting the criticism that Trump has had for receiving a call from the democratically elected president of Taiwan. In order to attack Trump for that, they are defending the line held by the Communist Party of China.
Yeah.
Now, I think when somebody does something good, whether you agree with them or not, you should congratulate them for that. But here Mr. Trump is being attacked for speaking to a democratic country's leader.
Thanks for pointing that out. It makes a lot of sense to me. Chantal, Amy, staying with Donald Trump, his defence secretary.
Well, I thought this-
Mad dog.
Mad dog. Well, I thought this was an interesting story because one of the differences between the American system and ours is obviously that period of time between the president being elected and actually taking office. And we've got here an interesting article by Neil Ferguson on Trump's latest appointment, which is his Secretary of Defense. And a sort of fairly detailed article suggesting that although there's been some criticism, one of the interesting things is that he apparently has no illusions about Putin, certainly one of the areas that Trump has been criticised for in the past. So I think an interesting appointment and one to watch out for.
OK, so perhaps not to be afraid, be very afraid. Might be the last story, Francis. See if we can squeeze another one in. You've got, in the Sunday People, an NHS investigation. I haven't seen this one. Tell us about it.
This is an important investigation from the People. I think looking at what's happening in our NHS, showing that 2/3 of NHS trusts were in deficit last year, that we're not recruiting enough nurses, and that, of course, health service staff are subject to that 1% pay cap, which next year, if inflation goes up, will mean real cuts in pay. So I think it's really asking fundamental questions about how we fund our NHS.
Well, there
and
it is.
whether
It's
we're
asking. We can see it in the
committed to
sub-headline there.
vision.
There is a stark choice: charging or higher tax. Which do you favour?
Well, I think most people would favour collecting the taxes that are due, particularly from the wealthy. But also, I think most people wouldn't agree that, as we saw in the autumn statements, that giving money away to corporations, cutting corporation tax, is the way forward when our NHS is in such dire need.
Let's end on The Great Escape to the movies. Chantal, Amy.
This is a short story. I thought it...
The annual Christmas
Well,
airings.
indeed,
isn't it?
one has a sense
Bit of a
of that.
tradition that's gone, though, now, hasn't it?
So, well, it's a story to do with a German POW who left his fortune, he's just passed away, to a Scottish village who looked after him while he was a prisoner of war in Scotland after the war. And it seems to me it's a nice story reminding us of some of the difficult history of Europe, but also looking towards humankind. And he remembers in particular how they smuggled him out for an evening to see a film.
What was it? They took along their brother's school uniform.
Well, it makes you wonder whether Scotland has a role in rehabilitating former right-wingers to a fairer and kinder view of society.
Yeah,
I suspect that the Scottish view is creating right-wingers as we speak. But
OK, I was just going to end on perhaps the next Austrian president, if it is he, might spend some time there. Thank you all very much indeed. Very good to see you. Thank you for taking us through some of the lead stories there in the Sunday papers. You're watching Murnahan on Sky News. Coming up.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.